When someone in your congregation falls suddenly ill, or a young family loses an income overnight, the community reflex is immediate. The phones start ringing, the word spreads, and the collection plate goes around. But that immediate response carries an invisible weight. Some members give twice, others can't give at all. Donor fatigue sets in quickly, and the family caught in the crisis feels the awkwardness of every public appeal and whispered conversation. At the exact same time, there is a second vulnerability operating behind the scenes. Treasurers and trustees serve as unpaid volunteers, often relying on generic commercial insurance that doesn't actually fit a religious institution. One employment dispute or premises liability claim, and those volunteers are exposed to personal financial ruin. Religious leaders find themselves managing two broken systems simultaneously. They are exhausting their members through informal, unpredictable mutual aid, while leaving their governing boards exposed by dangerously ill-fitting corporate insurance. We can map out these specific structural flaws on this chart, weighing the financial impact of a crisis against the community effort required to manage it. Ad hoc emergency collections sit right here, requiring high effort for a moderate financial impact. Meanwhile, uninsured lawsuits against the board sit in the catastrophic upper right zone. The Hearthkin system introduces a different mechanism, pulling both risks down into a low-effort, high-security position. It does this through a master policy. Instead of individual piecemeal coverage, the institution holds a single legal contract that underwrites the physical building, the volunteers who govern it, and the individual families in the pews simultaneously. This forces a distinct choice. You have to decide if formalizing your community's spontaneous charity into a rigid, premium-based insurance structure creates a more dignified environment for families in need, or if it risks hollowing out the emotional spirit of giving. We can weigh trade-offs using this comparison matrix. Under the status quo, financial input is unpredictable. The master policy replaces this with a strict $145 recurring premium. Output is equally distinct, delivering guaranteed payouts in days and enrolling members immediately without medical exams. That specific feature closes a severe vulnerability for congregations with high populations of recent immigrants or refugees, who often fall through the gaps of provincial healthcare during their first few years of arrival. Delivering that automatic dignity for a vulnerable family requires a collective commitment. You have to convince the entire congregation to pay a non-negotiable fee during times of peace, so the funds are there before the crisis hits. Introducing a mandatory $145 premium immediately raises an administrative wall. Every congregation has members who simply cannot afford that annual cost. To solve that friction, the master policy is paired with a hardship fund. This is a separate, community-controlled financial reserve established alongside the formal insurance structure. Wealthier members can direct their charitable giving into this fund, allowing the institution to silently subsidize the premiums of lower-income families. No one is turned away, and the families receiving the help maintain their privacy. That same reserve serves as a safety net for catastrophic events that insurance regulators cannot underwrite, like an unexpected eviction or a sudden separation involving children. While this structure successfully protects the poorest members, the operational reality changes. The treasurer is no longer writing emotional appeals for a Sunday bulletin. They are managing a complex, sliding-scale budget and maintaining rigorous internal accounting. Moving past the individual families, the institution itself carries a massive physical liability. Religious buildings host daily community kitchens, weekend festivals, and high foot traffic that generic commercial policies rarely account for. Standard policies often hide severe gaps in coverage. A typical commercial framework might completely miss the vulnerabilities of a digital donation platform, or leave a community exposed when volunteer drivers transport goods for a banquet. By treating the religious organization as a specialized entity, the master policy includes high-limit directors' and officers' indemnity. If a governance decision leads to a lawsuit, the unpaid volunteers are shielded from personal bankruptcy. Securing that level of protection requires administrative discipline. To qualify for specific abuse and misconduct coverage, the governing board must adopt, enforce, and actively audit modernized safeguarding protocols. Bundling the property, the board, and the congregation into one contract effectively closes those institutional blind spots. However, making that transition will likely require you to sever long-standing political ties with the local commercial broker your community has used for years. To determine if this system makes sense, we can map your situation on this decision tree. The ideal candidate is an established institution carrying high board liability, burdened by constant collections for vulnerable populations. Conversely, transient, newly formed groups with erratic attendance should avoid this entirely. The absolute prerequisite for this architecture to function is a stable core of members. You need a leadership team capable of managing enrollment pipelines and committing to a predictable, fixed annual budget. Adopting this requires a shift in how you view your congregation. Hearthkin only works if the entire community is willing to treat membership as a tangible administrative safety net, rather than relying on it as just a spiritual affiliation. Using a highly regulated master policy to care for a congregation is a very modern mechanism, but the instinct driving it is ancient. Mutual aid societies predated the commercial insurance industry by centuries. Brotherhoods, sisterhoods, and early faith traditions built communal funds for a very specific reason. They pooled their small resources so no single family would have to stand alone when a crisis hit. When commercial insurance corporations eventually displaced those intimate community-run societies, the math improved, but the cultural connection was lost. Protection started coming from an anonymous corporation across town, instead of from the people sitting in the pews next to you. This program restores that lost communal frame. It pairs the familiar structure of community belonging with the strict operational integrity, underwriting, and licensing demanded by a modern regulator. Ultimately, true community protection relies on the dignity of the arrangement. The foundational unit of any welfare system isn't a policy or a tax bracket. It is a specific moment in time. A sudden hospitalization, a workplace injury, a fire that claims an apartment. It is the immediate, unpredictable shock, where the rapid availability of cash determines whether a household recovers or collapses into years of foreclosure and lost dignity. When that shock hits, we look to three pathways for rescue. The commercial insurance market often depends on a fragile chain of prior paperwork and correct policy choices. The state response, while massive, almost always arrives slowly. That leaves the third pathway. In a remarkable number of cases, the actual financial response comes from a local intermediate institution, most often a religious community. But because these groups lack formal protective mechanisms, their response takes a specific unstructured shape: the ad hoc emergency fundraising drive, passing the hat, starting the crowdfund. These drives frequently hit their financial targets, but they extract a heavy, unmeasured toll. Wealthier members experience compounding donor fatigue. Community leaders burn out managing endless crisis appeals instead of focusing on pastoral care. And the family in distress must endure the quiet humiliation of having their private emergency broadcasted as a communal charity project. Spontaneous charity is a conviction, but relying on constant, irregular mobilization to handle catastrophic risk is structurally unstable over the long run. A resolution to this instability exists at the intersection of behavioral economics, sociology, and theology. If we look at how these three fields converge, they point toward a specific model: the community-administered mutual protection pool. Implementing this model requires us to address two separate breakdowns. First, the behavioral failure that keeps vulnerable people from buying commercial insurance. Second, the sociological failure that causes voluntary communities to lose their formal membership base. Neither of these outcomes results from a lack of moral conviction. They are architectural problems, and they require a structural, institutional solution. Let's start with the behavioral failure. In economics, whether someone buys insurance comes down to their willingness to pay. This is the maximum threshold a person will spend on a premium, calculated by weighing the true probability of a disaster against the financial ruin it would cause. But humans are not rational calculators. We suffer from a documented cognitive bias known as probability neglect. When an abstract risk has a very low probability of happening, even if the impact would be devastating, the human brain systematically fails to perceive it accurately. This visual equation shows willingness to pay in action. Notice what happens when the true probability is replaced by the brain's perception. The perceived probability drops, dragging the household's willingness to pay down with it, until it falls below the actual market premium. The individual declines coverage, even when the math suggests they should purchase it. For households operating under chronic financial stress, the daily friction of poverty consumes immense mental bandwidth. This cognitive scarcity adds a severe weight to the equation, reducing the capacity to evaluate remote future risks. Their willingness to pay collapses. Vulnerable populations often remain uninsured because the individual market demands a level of prospective planning that human cognition, particularly under the stress of scarcity, is not built to sustain. Now look at the sociological failure. In 1965, economist Mancure Olson outlined the logic of collective action, isolating a dynamic known as the free rider problem. Religious and voluntary communities primarily produce non-excludable benefits. These are diffuse public goods, like a supportive moral atmosphere, cultural connection, or open religious services. Because these goods are available to everyone regardless of status, an individual has a rational incentive to consume them without formally joining the roster, paying membership dues, or taking on administrative burdens. Over decades, this rational individual behavior aggregates into a crisis. Formal membership roles thin out, and financial bases erode, threatening the institution's ability to maintain its basic functions. A community that asks for the costs of membership without offering concrete, exclusive benefits in return is structurally programmed to unravel. We can address both the behavioral failure of the individual and the sociological failure of the group with a single architectural feature, a community-administered mutual aid pool, backed by a licensed insurer. Instead of asking 300